Afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for all attending. I think we've got a very high turnout for what should be or will be an excellent event looking at biodiversity net gain, and we're really looking about developers and how you can prepare yourselves for January next year. Not long to go until we have biodiversity net gain legislation and regulations live and kicking. So I will very quickly introduce you to our four expert speakers. We're starting with Professor Bob Lee at the University of Birmingham. Bob will kind of give us an introduction into BNG from a kind of legal and policy perspective. And each of our speakers has only 10 minutes, so we'll be rattling through this pretty quickly. Then handing over to Maureen. Maureen is an expert in plant ecology at the University of Brighton. Maureen will be looking at how we can use satellite data to sort of inform us on what's happening on terms of the biodiversity on sites. It's looking at the ecology. And then it's turning from Maureen to Richard Fleming, CEO of Map Impact. Richard will be kind of looking at how we turn that kind of technical and theoretical information from Maureen into practical aspects of assessing what's happening on the ground using satellites in terms of biodiversity assessments. And then lastly, last speaker will be Ray Collins, who's head of architecture and planning at Cullen Homes. And so Ray will be looking at how we actually can use the products that we have Landmark. We've launched one product, that's Biodiversity Check, and we've got another one, Biodiversity Report, coming out in January. How we can use those for sort of early stage scoping. So it should be a very full and interesting time that we have with our four expert speakers. So I'm going to hand straight over to Bob. Thanks very much, Bob.
Thank you, Simon. So I've got 10 slides and 10 minutes. So as Simon says, it will be short and to the point. So given the dire state of biodiversity loss in the UK, and given failure of previous policy to reverse this trend, what we now have is a biodiversity net gain objective, which attaches to planning applications. And just to shorten this language of the statute here, so what we're saying is the biodiversity value attributed to the development should exceed the biodiversity value pre-development by at least 10%. So 10% enhancement as a result of the development, quite a tall order. And this needs to be secured for 30 years. And the way in which it will be secured usually will be either by a planning obligation, a Section 106 agreement, a legally binding undertaking attributable to and attaching to the planning permission, or by a conservation covenant, which is a private agreement, but a private agreement to conserve the natural attributes of the land. So looking at this statutory language, here's the notion of gain. And what we're saying here is that what we have post-development should exceed what we had pre-development by at least 10%. And that should be reflected in and measured by biodiversity units. Now, biodiversity units, I don't really have time to go into, but they are the currency of net gain. So this means that applications for planning permission in England will need from January 24, the date down there, to contain a biodiversity net gain plan. Let me just say a little bit about jurisdiction. This law under the Environment Act 2021 only applies in England, but it's not as though there's nothing in Scotland and Wales. Scotland has recently changed its planning policy framework to urge biodiversity enhancement In Wales, as far back as 2016, Section 6 of the Environment Wales Act urged all public bodies to engage in biodiversity enhancement, and that's reflected in Planning Policy Wales. So you may well find that in Scotland and in Wales, planning authorities are asking for biodiversity net gain. They're simply not using the metric that I'm going to talk about that applies in England. It will apply for most sites from January 2024, but there will be a delay for smaller sites because there will be a simplified metric for small sites. Small sites are sites in residential terms of less than 10 dwellings, or on a site smaller than 1 hectare, and in the case of non-residential, on a site less than 1 hectare, or where the floor space of the development is less than 1,000 square meters. And then in 2025, we'll finally get the extension to nationally significant infrastructure. Now, word of caution, we are still awaiting, even though this takes effect January 24, further guidance and regulations. So some of what I say is built on DEFRA's responses to the consultation, but we haven't yet seen the regulations. There will be certain exemptions because this applies to planning applications. Permitted development is not included, and there's an exemption for what are called urgent developments on Crown land. And then the regulations, if they match the consultation, will contain 3 exemptions for small activity: a de minimis threshold for anything of 25 meters square or less, a carve out for householder applications, and a possible carve out, though we await the regulations, for small scale self-building. And then there are other things that aren't quite exemptions, but in a sense work in this way. So I've already said that small sites, for example, will have a simplified metric. In relation to urban brownfield sites, it is possible that we have sites that will have, in effect, a 0 scoring in relation to habitat. So though not formally exempt, there's very little utility in trying to apply the metric, and we will see what happens with those when regulations are out. So in the middle here, we have our biodiversity net gain plan, which has to go in with our planning permission. We look at the site that we are developing, we assess its existing biodiversity value, and I'll show how we do that in a moment. We show how we've tried to minimize the impacts of development on biodiversity and on habitats. And that is now a statutory responsibility. So we'll need a statement about that. And then we assess the post-development value of the on-site biodiversity. If that is greater than 10%, because, for example, our green design has delivered some biodiversity net gain, then we're home and dry. But if it's less than 10%, then we need to gain that 10% enhancement, and we may go right of the screen off-site. And we may try and gain that value from the enhancement of an off-site habitat. That isn't the only way in which we can do it. We can buy biodiversity credits, statutory credits, and I'll talk about those in a moment. We can purchase biodiversity units from the commercial market, but if we do try and enhance a habitat off-site, then that activity will need to be registered on a national register of biodiversity net gain sites. Now, it's very important to emphasize, therefore, that on-site gain is greatly to be preferred. It's easier and it's likely to be less costly where it's viable. One of the reasons for that is that as we go off-site, there is a spatial risk multiplier, which I will talk about. But it's a fraction, and because it's a fraction, and because the fraction gets smaller the further away we get from our present development, going some distance away to an off-site enhanced habitat will prove much more challenging. And finally, the statutory biodiversity credits that I talked about come in at quite a price. These are issued by Natural England. The base figure is 42,000 against possibly a commercial market figure of 30,000. And they rise depending on the nature of the habitat at stake. So they even rise as far as £625,000 for example, the draining of a peat lake. So let me try and show how you establish the baseline. You take the area of your present site and you multiply it by a factor that allows for its distinctiveness. What we're trying to do here in this calculation is look at habitat quality, rarity of species, and connectivity to other habitats. So we multiply the area by a distinctiveness factor. If it's grassland, it may be ranked 2 or 3, so not a particularly high multiplier. And we also take into account condition, 1 to 3, poor, moderate, and good, and use that multiplier. And then there's a multiplier for significance in terms of its landscape and its connectivity. And that gives us our baseline. It gives us the baseline of what we've got on the site that we wish to develop. And then from that baseline, we calculate our loss or gain. If that gain is 10% on site, then as I've said before, we're home and dry. But if it's a loss, then we might have to look for off-site enhancement somewhere. And on that new off-site, we'll have to reapply the same calculation, that calculation again, but this time we have additional multipliers for spatial risk, the distance it is away from our present site, and we also have to allow for the time needed to gain the enhancement on site, and of course that may take some time. And so we see from this that on-site or local enhancement makes every sense, and failing to secure land either on-site or off-site may mean that we will have to turn to the market and even to statutory credits, which will likely prove the most expensive option. So in conclusion, there are some headaches for developers, at least in the sense that careful choices now need to be made. There is some good news for landowners because there are opportunities for landowners, and that's enhanced by what we might call stacking. So for example, if you're a farmer with an environmental land management scheme, or perhaps a dairy farmer with nutrient neutrality payments, nothing that you gain from BNG affects those other payments. So you may be paid more than once, essentially, for the same work. For lawyers, this is a complex system, and there's a great deal of work in terms of advice, but perhaps especially in terms of the drafting those agreements, those Section 106 agreements and conservation covenants that will secure the enhancement. There are certainly jobs for ecologists, and I think there's serious worry that we will lack experienced ecologists, particularly within the local planning framework. And above all, there's a need for data-driven solutions, and that's a good point on which to hand over to Jane.